written and created by Sad Girl Productions. The following content is for informational, educational, and documentary purposes only. Sad Girl Productions does not condone, promote, or encourage any form of criminal activity, violence, or gang affiliation. All individuals discussed are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Portions of this narrative are based on public records, news reports by veteran journalists such as Kim Bolan, and official police briefings. Viewer discretion is advised. Bindy Johal, better known on the streets as Bindy, was arguably one of the very first notoriously known Punjabi gangsters in Canada before social media existed. He became one of the very first Indo-Canadian gangsters to be covered by media, frequently appearing across TV screens in the Lower Mainland. To a generation of South Asian youth in Surrey and Richmond, he was a middle finger to a world that wanted them silent. As he stood before news cameras in 1994, he would utter the words that would later define his legacy. "I'm still around, bitch." During the rant, he wasn't just threatening a rival, he was claiming a city. 20 years after the single bullet at the Palladium, the music has stopped and the club is long closed. But the legend of Bindy Johal refuses to die. Bindy arrived in Canada at age 4. Throughout his elementary years, he was the classic immigrant success story. He was academically gifted and, by all accounts, a well-behaved kid. To understand the man Bindy Johal eventually became, you have to look at the kid who was once the pride of his parents. He wasn't a born criminal. He was an honor roll student who was exceptionally bright, but he was growing up in an East Van environment where being smart wasn't enough to stay safe. By the time he reached junior high school, he was just another kid trying to navigate the complex social hierarchy of East Vancouver. One of his old teachers at Sir Charles Tupper, Rob Sandhu, famously noted that in grade 8, Bindy showed no signs of the violence that would later define him. In the mid-90s, if you were a brown kid in the Lower Mainland, you basically lived in two worlds. In one, you were expected to be the model minority, a quiet student and the sons of hard-working immigrant parents. Most kids in the Sikh community of the Lower Mainland were expected to wear what's known as a dastar, or better known as a turban, to cover their uncut hair as a cultural symbol of honor and self-respect. Many of them were proud of their heritage and their families. But in Canada at the time, this made them a target for bullying, and most of the time you had to take the abuse. But in the other world, there was Bindy Johal. Bindy's story isn't a simple rise and fall. It's a paradox. He was a man who allegedly put racists on stretchers to protect his community. For the kids growing up in Surrey and Richmond, their identity was under constant attack. They were proud of their roots, but they were exhausted by the bullies who targeted them for their turbans or the color of their skin. They were caught in a vice: the expectations of a traditional home and the reality of a hostile street. The streets of Vancouver didn't always respect their cultural dignity. Bindy Johal was an example of someone who walked a path that was a total departure from the values of his community. He took the spiritual resilience of his parents, and he brought it to the cold, hard lifestyle of the street. He was a man who saw the racism directed at his people and decided to strike back with a violence that shocked everyone, including his own community. Just like many Caucasian youth looked up to and followed Jonathan Bacon, many Indo-Canadian kids would idolize Bindy Johal in the same manner. He eventually became a neighborhood celebrity to some, and somewhat of a local hero. He was well respected for what he stood for. He was one of the first people in his area to refuse to take the abuse from the white kids in the community. But in trading his heritage for the life of a drug kingpin, Bindy didn't just fight off the racists. He brought a war home to the very streets his community worked so hard to build. Teachers at Sir Charles Tupper Secondary describe him as a split personality. On paper, Bindy Johal is a top-tier student with a promising future in higher education, but in the hallways, he was a bit of a gangster. Friends say that when he was around 17 years old, he had become a shield for other South Asian students, often being the first to throw a punch when racial slurs were heard. While his parents saw a son destined for university, The Vancouver police were beginning to see a name that kept appearing in reports of street-level scuffles. Bindy realized early on that his intellect wouldn't stop a group of white kids from jumping him, so he began to cultivate a hard exterior. He started working out obsessively and made a conscious decision he would never be a victim. This is where the protector myth started. He would step in to defend other kids who were being bullied, but he did it with a level of violence that worried the school administration. By grade 12, Bindy was living a double life. He was still pulling high grades, but his lack of respect for authority was reaching a boiling point. He had zero patience for teachers or administrators, and he felt they didn't understand the reality happening on the streets. The legend goes that the vice principal called Bindy into the office to discuss his attitude and alleged gang affiliations. Bindy felt the administrator was talking down to him, treating him like a thug rather than a student. According to the rumors, Bindy didn't just argue. He allegedly launched a brutal physical assault, reportedly kicking the vice principal so hard he required emergency surgery. That was the point of no return. The honor roll student died that day, and the gangster was born in the eyes of the law. The act got him expelled, and he officially became a former Tupper student. His family moved him to Richmond, hoping a change of scenery would save him. He attended McNair Secondary, but the damage was done. The system now viewed him as a violent offender. Within months, he was arrested for smashing car windows in the school parking lot and got into a bar fight where he allegedly used a broken bottle as a weapon. This is the villain origin story that isn't really a villain story. It's a story of a kid who felt he had to become a monster to survive the environment he was in. To understand how Bindy went from a kid in a jail cell to one of the most feared gangsters in BC, we have to take a good look at the Dosanjh era. It was the birth of a new kind of power structure in the Lower Mainland. In the late 80s and early 90s, the Punjabi Mafia wasn't a formal organization, it was a loose collection of crews. At the top were Ron and Jimmy Dosanjh. They were the blueprint. Ron was the sophisticated businessman who stayed behind the scenes while Jimmy was known as the muscle of the organization. In the early 1990s, Ranjit Dosanjh was a central figure in Vancouver's social and political landscape. He operated with a level of community influence that made his alleged lifestyle choices particularly shocking for the average person living in the Lower Mainland. The Seattle Times reported that Ron Dosanjh was once the president of the Vancouver branch of the International Sikh Youth Federation. Unlike many of his contemporaries who stayed in the shadows, it's said that Ron Dosanjh held a prominent public role in the early 90s. But he is most commonly described in public reporting as a Vancouver-area Indo-Canadian gangster. Despite the allegations against him, he was said to be an active participant within the Orthodox Sikh community, often seen at local gurdwaras and participating in community events. He is widely remembered for his highly public feud between him and Bindy Johal. During this period, there was a changing of the guard in the back alleys of Fraser Street. The old-school biker gangs and European syndicates were finding themselves squeezed by a younger, equally aggressive force. Leading the charge were the Dosanjh brothers, but it was one of their newest recruits that had police worried. Bindy Johal was barely out of high school and had already been sporting a reputation for unhinged violence. These personality traits helped him get recognized in the underworld, and he later reportedly joined the Dosanjh crew. Sources say Johal isn't just a soldier. He was a student of the game, learning how to turn street-level chaos into a multi-million-dollar cocaine empire. When Bindy joined the Dosanjhs, he didn't look like a traditional gangster from the city. He was athletic, well-spoken, and sharp. Because he had cut his hair and didn't wear a turban, he could move through white spaces, posh nightclubs, high-end car dealerships, without immediately drawing the immigrant profile that the police were watching. According to sources, he started as a high-level debt collector. If someone owed the Dosanjhs money, Bindy was the one sent to explain the consequences. He didn't just use a gun, he used psychological terror. He would find out where people lived, where their kids went to school, and let them know that the old rules of the neighborhood were dead. It was during this time that Bindy met Faisal Dean. Dean was a member of Los Diablos, a multi-ethnic street gang that handled the dirty work for the Dosanjhs. Bindy and Dean realized they were the ones doing the actual work, while the Dosanjhs took the lion's share of the profit. This planted the seed of the betrayal. Bindy began to resent the big shots who sat in their offices while he was on the front lines, dodging bullets. Around this time, the Dosanjhs were said to often refer to Bindy as a small-time operator, or a punk. For a man who felt he was the protector of his community and the smartest guy in the room, being called small-time by his own people was an insult he couldn't forgive. He wasn't just working for them anymore, he was studying their weaknesses, waiting for them to slip up. When Jimmy Dosanjh was arrested for the murder of Teodoro Salcedo, the power balance shifted. With the muscle of the organization behind bars, Bindy saw his opening. On March 14, 1991, a pivotal event in the history of organized crime took place in Vancouver, British Columbia. It served as a catalyst for the rise of one of Canada's most notorious gangsters. That gangster was Bindy Johal. It was the murder of a man named Teodoro Salcedo, a Colombian national, and someone who was allegedly a known drug trafficker. His death triggered a leadership vacuum that allowed younger, more violent factions to seize control of the local drug trade. Jimmy Dosanjh would eventually be arrested for the murder of Teodoro Salcedo. The power balance shifted. With the muscle of the organization behind bars, Bindy began to see his opening. The case was highly publicized, but ultimately resulted in an acquittal for Dosanjh. Despite the lack of a conviction, the period during which Jimmy Dosanjh was in custody awaiting trial changed the landscape of the Vancouver underworld. While Jimmy Dosanjh was in jail for the Salcedo case, his associate Bindy Johal took advantage of the leadership void. Johal began operating independently, hijacking drug shipments and establishing his own violent crew. This split is what led to a bloody feud between the Dosanjh brothers and Bindy Johal. During this era, various ethnic gangs were shifting alliances. Some reports link the hit on Salcedo to broader tensions between suppliers and local Vancouver distributors, particularly as younger gang members sought to cut out middlemen and increase their profit margins. Instead of staying loyal, Bindy and Faisal Dean broke away. They started their own cocaine distribution line, directly competing with Ron Dosanjh. It was the ultimate "fuck you" to the men who thought they owned him. It transformed Bindy Johal from a low-level enforcer into a crime boss and eventually led to some of the most sensational legal proceedings in Canadian history. Once there was an acquittal for Jimmy Dosanjh for Salcedo's murder, it did not bring peace. Instead, it continued to solidify a rift between the Dosanjh brothers and Bindy Johal. It has been said that Jimmy Dosanjh reportedly took out a $230,000 contract on Johal's life. In a legendary underworld double cross, the hitman hired by the brothers instead went to Johal with the information, which led him to offer to pay him more to flip the contract. In February 1994, the hitman allegedly lured Jimmy to a meeting to inspect some stolen electronics. It was late on a Friday night when it occurred, in what police later described as a cold-blooded execution. Sources say Dosanjh was lured to the back alley on the 6100 block of Prince Edward Street under the guise of inspecting the shipment. Investigators believe the ambush was orchestrated by his own associates, whose loyalties had secretly shifted to rival Bindy Johal. The hit, allegedly carried out by men who Dosanjh trusted, marked a bloody escalation in the city's ongoing gang war. This dispute between Bindy Johal and the Dosanjh brothers is what led to some of Canada's first celebrity gangsters. Unlike traditional mobsters who stayed in the shadows, they used the media as a battlefield, appearing on news programs to trade insults and death threats in real time. In April of 1994, the CTV NewsHour aired a surreal segment that essentially treated a gang war like a professional wrestling promo. At the time, Jimmy Dosanjh had just been murdered, and according to Samuel Kerr's article in Medium, Bindy Johal was the prime suspect. In a now infamous clip, Ron Dosanjh appeared on camera to address Johal directly. He famously told the reporter that if he saw Johal at his house, he'd shoot him between the eyes. He mocked Johal, calling him a nobody, and famously saying, Maybe that's why your life is worth a loonie on the streets." In response, Johal, dressed in a leather jacket with his hair styled high after he was invited into the studio to respond. He was cold and dismissive, telling the cameras, "This Jimmy Dosanjh, they portrayed him as a hitman. From what I've seen of him on the street, I don't think he could hit his way out of a paper bag." Perhaps the most famous piece of footage in Canadian gang history came after an assassination attempt on Johal. While he was in hiding, a hit squad mistakenly targeted his neighbor, who was walking Bindy's dog. The neighbor was killed in a hail of AK-47 fire. A CBC News crew tracked Johal down a week later. Standing by a red Acura NSX, Johal looked directly into the lens and delivered his most famous line. "I just want these guys to know, you've got another thing coming, bitch. I'm still around." Just days after this legendary media beef, Ron Dosanjh was sadly assassinated while stopped at a red light. He was in his red pickup truck when gunmen pulled alongside and opened fire with an AK-47, killing him instantly. Johal and 5 co-accused were eventually charged with the Dosanjh murders in that same year. This became one of the most expensive and scandalous trials in Canadian history. In a scandal that sent shockwaves through the Canadian legal system, a 43-year-old mother of 2 who was one of the jurors in the high-profile trial was revealed to have engaged in a torrid affair with one of the defendants, Peter Gill, while the trial was still in progress. The Gillian Guest scandal wasn't just a brief lapse in judgment. It was a systematic dismantling of a multi-million-dollar murder trial from the inside. From the first day of jury selection, Guest was reportedly intoxicated by Peter Gill, Bindy Johal's former brother-in-law. Court clerks later testified that they observed Guest flipping her hair, smiling coyly, and maintaining intense eye contact with Gill, while the Crown was presenting evidence of brutal gangland executions. According to Vice, the first kiss occurred during a break in court proceedings when the 2 met at Stanley Park and kissed under a tree. And while the judge was warning the jury about the gravity of their duties, Guest was inviting Gill to her North Vancouver townhouse. At one point, Gill allegedly told her to convict 2 of the others, but asked to ensure that he would walk free. During the trial, jurors described Guest as confrontational and not interested in other people's opinions. When other jurors pointed to the evidence, Guest reportedly suggested that anyone who found the defendants guilty was a racist. After 8 months and millions of dollars spent, her pressure on the other jurors worked. The jury would return a not guilty verdict for all 6 men accused. The acquittal of notorious gangster Bindy Johal and his associates led to a cloud of suspicion, with legal experts calling the case one of the most expensive and scandalous failures in the history of British Columbia's courts. It was said that her behavior is what led to police becoming seriously concerned with the massive legal bust. This led to an investigation. They eventually bugged Guest's home and also started tapping her phone. They caught her admitting to her daughter and friends that she had been sleeping with Gill during the trial. The investigation into Gillian Guest relied heavily on the wiretaps. These recordings shattered her defense that the relationship began after the trial. Guest was heard describing her and Gill as the Romeo and Juliet of the 90s. She told her daughter, "I have this secret world. It's the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me." The tapes revealed her tactical mindset. She told a friend that she was working the other jurors, specifically targeting the weak ones to ensure they didn't vote for a conviction. Most chillingly, she discussed a plan where she would vote to convict 2 of the lesser defendants to make the jury's not guilty verdict for Peter Gill and Bindy Johal look more credible to the public. Guest became the first juror in Canada to be convicted of obstruction of justice. She famously told reporters, "I have been convicted for falling in love and nothing more." During her house arrest, she remained defiant and even posed for a media photo shoot in a bathtub, showing off her electronic monitoring ankle bracelet. Guest served 12 weeks of an 18-month sentence. Peter Gill was eventually sentenced to 6 years for his role in the obstruction, though he was never retried for the murders. The trial's failure allowed Bindy Johal to return to the streets, bigger and more well-known than ever. This is when he cemented his reputation as untouchable. After the acquittal in late 1995, Bindy Johal didn't go into hiding. He went on a victory lap. This is the period where he became a household name, appearing on the news regularly to taunt the police. Bindy understood the power of the press. He famously told a BCTV reporter, "If you're a gangster, you're a gangster. If you're a person that's going to do something to me, don't talk about it, do it." With the Dosanjh brothers gone, Bindy consolidated his power. He formed a tight-knit group that would later be known as the Elite Crew. This wasn't just a traditional street gang in BC, it was a high-functioning hit squad with a large drug distribution network. Because he had just beaten a slam-dunk murder charge, the streets believed he had the courts in his pocket. Witnesses became even more terrified to speak, and his rivals began to disappear or flip to his side just to stay alive. But by 1997, Bindy started showing cracks in his armor. While Bindy was clearly enjoying his street fame, the pressure from the police and the internal paranoia of the elite crew started to boil over. Like many gangsters before him, Bindy began to suspect his own men of being informants or becoming too greedy. He allegedly ordered hits on his own associates to maintain absolute loyalty. While Johal was famously acquitted of the Dosanjh murders in 1995, his legal luck started to shift in 1997. Following the assault charges, he was denied bail after being labeled a menace to society by the court. He would end up spending most of late 1997 in pretrial custody. Major allegations and court battles continued to follow him after the high-profile 1994 murder trial and the multiple hearings that came with it. Around this time, a man named Bal Buttar became one of Bindy's most trusted generals. Buttar was a heavy hitter on the streets and was one of the people who managed the crew's muscle. However, Buttar himself later confessed that Bindy's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and even called him bloodthirsty. Police sources indicate that by 1997, the elite crew had become one of the primary enforcement arms for the Indo-Canadian underworld, operating under a code of absolute silence that frustrated investigators for years. Bindy Johal had transitioned from a street-level enforcer to a high-level puppet master. Unlike traditional gangs that fought over corners, the elite crew was a service provider. They handled debt collection, murder for hire, and drug distribution logistics for larger organizations, including the Hells Angels and the Triads. At his peak in 1997, Bindy and the crew were said to be earning between $500,000 and $900,000 per week, although this has never been publicly confirmed by police. His enterprise was rumored to be valued at approximately $4 million annually. It was fueled by the black market for electronics, luxury vehicles, and of course narcotics. In 1997, he was convicted of the aggravated assault after the brutal bar fight where he attacked two men with a broken beer bottle. The judge officially labeled him a menace to society. His temper remained his biggest liability. The year 1997 is when his personality made a major shift toward extreme paranoia. Bindy began to realize that his untouchable status was attracting too much heat, and he suspected those closest to him were looking for an exit. It was rumored that just a few months earlier, the elite crew was involved in a kidnapping of a man named Randy Chan. He was allegedly a rival dealer who was kidnapped because Roman Man was angry over the quality of a cocaine shipment. Man felt the product was too diluted despite the premium price paid. When Roman Man and Bindy's group kidnapped Randy Chan, he wasn't just snatching a rival, he was allegedly snatching the brother of a high-ranking Lotus member. This is possibly why the heat in 1997 became so unbearable. In the late 1990s, the Lotus Gang was one of the most powerful and structured Asian organized crime groups in British Columbia. It was another bold move he made in the underworld. Because the kidnapping was such a loud crime, the police started breathing down the necks of everyone involved. The kidnapping of Randy Chan had ended with his safe release, but investigators warned the conflict was far from over. Sources close to the Lotus Gang suggested that Raymond Chan was allegedly incensed by the disrespect shown to his family. It was said that during the kidnapping, Chan was held captive for around 56 hours. He spent a portion of this time bound in the trunk of a car. It was reported that Bindy's crew allegedly demanded $5 million and a large quantity of gold for Randy's release. In the end, it's been widely reported that they paid a ransom of 5 kilograms of cocaine, and Chan was released unharmed. The repercussions for the kidnapping, along with an alleged shooting at the Hells Angels clubhouse, is reportedly what pushed Bindy over the edge. His lifestyle was catching up to him. In a move that was considered seriously reckless by most criminals, it was said that members of Johal's group drove past the fortified clubhouse and sprayed it with bullets. Shortly after that, Mann allegedly told Bindy he wanted out. In the gang world, getting out usually means talking to the cops in the eyes of a leader like Bindy. Mann was a seasoned criminal, but it's said that he understood the hierarchy and consequences for his actions. Testimony from the Randy Chan trial indicate that when Roman Mann told Bindy he wanted out because of the heat from the lifestyle, Johal brutally beat him. Shortly after that, he was murdered. Roman Mann's body was found in December 1997 under the Queensboro Bridge. He had been shot in the back of the head. Police believe Johal killed him to prevent him from becoming a witness or an informant after the HA shooting and the Randy Chan kidnapping. It is documented in the Randy Chan trial records that Roman Mann was the primary physical kidnapper. However, the Crown's theory was that Bindy Johal orchestrated the plot, so it's rumored that with the death of Mann, he effectively silenced one of the main witnesses. But he also lost one of his most capable soldiers. By the end of summer 1997, the Lotus Gang and the elite crew were in a state of high-tension, Cold War because of the Chan kidnapping, and Bindy's inner circle was shrinking due to his own paranoia. After the death of Mann, the relationship between Bindy and his most loyal enforcers began to deteriorate. Bindy moved into 1998 more isolated than ever. He was becoming a liability to the larger crime groups in the city. The city had basically evolved into a high-speed cycle of payback where violence wasn't just about money. It became about reputation, fear, and survival. As 1998 began, the name Bal Buttar became increasingly synonymous with the violence plaguing the Lower Mainland. Baljit Singh, better known as Bal, was a Lower Mainland gangster who most often described himself as an enforcer connected to the elite crew. The Lower Mainland was deep into a violent era of Indo-Canadian gang conflict, where hits weren't just happening, they were being planned. He was one of the names that kept coming up from that period. In his interviews with Kim Bolan, Buttar explained that Bindy viewed his associates as disposable. Years later, after being permanently injured, Buttar became a notorious source of inside information about how the power structure operated and how killings were carried out behind the scenes. The atmosphere around Bindy was increasingly described as unstable and blood-soaked, where enemies weren't just competitors, they were targets, and the circle around him was fast becoming a kill zone. This is when Bindy's story turns into full war mode, paranoia, revenge, and a city basically watching it unfold in real time. One of the clearest mid-1998 markers that shows how far things had escalated is the July 1998 murder of Venus News Mackenzie, which reporting later tied into Bindy's crew conflicts and personal rivalries. According to Global News, it targeted the family home of an alleged associate of Bindy Johal and marked a shift toward extreme violence against family members. According to a report from the Vancouver Sun, Buttar says he arranged for the murder of Venus News Mackenzie on Johal's orders. Johal had claimed that Mackenzie had drugs in the house. He was killed by a gunshot wound to the head. He was 27 years old at the time of his death. Reporting described the killing as a violent break-in involving multiple suspects, and academic research places the shooting in the city of Vancouver. According to reports from Global News, Venus Mackenzie was not a known high-profile gangster himself, but he was the half-brother of a man named Sun News Lal, also known as Sonny Mackenzie. This murder didn't happen in isolation. Just months later, the message got even clearer. In October 1998, another close associate of Bindy's, a man named Vikash Chand, was allegedly lured to the rags-to-riches motor cars. It was a used car lot located on Boundary Road in Burnaby, BC. Chand was lured to the lot under the guise of meeting with one of his business partners. It's been said that while Chand was bent over changing a license plate on a car, a gunman approached and shot him 7 times at close range. Shortly after the shooting, it's said that Bindy Johal and Bal Batar actually arrived at the scene. They were seen by witnesses and police at the Rags to Riches lot, standing over the body of their fallen associate. A Supreme Court of Canada summary states 5 people were charged with Chand's murder. The Crown later argued that this was a contract killing worth $40,000. For law enforcement and underworld observers, this was the ultimate signal that Bindy's territory was no longer safe. The great wall he had built around his crew had been breached from the inside. There had now been a series of murders of associates that had been close to Johal. According to the Vancouver Sun, RCMP worked the file, and police at the time said that a crew named the Big Circle Boys had paid off several others involved in the murder. The city of Vancouver was already deep in a cycle of targeted killings, the kind that looked organized, planned, and deliberately executed. And on the morning of December 20th, 1998, that violence reached one of its most infamous moments. At around 4:30 a.m., Bindy Johal was inside Vancouver's Palladium nightclub, dancing in a packed room. At the age of 27, he had already become one of the city's most well-known gangsters, surviving everything that comes with the lifestyle. Bindy Johal had built a reputation on being loud, fearless, and present. A man whose name traveled faster than the facts. A figure whose image became as powerful as his actual power. The Palladium wasn't some quiet backroom spot. It was a packed nightclub. A public place. Loud music, bodies shoulder to shoulder, lights flashing. It's the kind of environment where people assume the crowd itself is protection. And in that crowd, on that dance floor, Bindy Johal was dancing, not hiding, not slipping through shadows, not keeping his head down. He was out in the open, exactly the way people had come to expect. As Bindy let his guard down, someone was already watching. By that point, he didn't just have small-time rivals. He had a list of enemies that stretched across the entire province. The moment Bindy relaxed, the danger moved in. Using the crowd as a camouflage, a single act of violence was executed cleanly. Bindy Johal was shot from behind, struck in the back of the head, right there on the dance floor. And in the immediate seconds after the shot, the club went into panic. Movement in every direction, bodies pushing toward exits, and confusion swallowing the scene. The shooter had got close enough to execute a clean headshot in a packed room, then disappeared into the confusion without a clear identification. According to old news reports, the shooter had escaped through a back door of the nightclub, triggering an alarm in the process. Following the shooting, Bindy Johal was rushed by ambulance to the Vancouver General Hospital Emergency Department. Given his status, the hospital was immediately placed under heavy police guard to prevent further violence or retaliation on the premises. Police had estimated there was between 300 and 400 people inside the club at the time of the shooting. During the investigation, the Vancouver police interviewed hundreds of patrons. Despite the close proximity of the shooter and Bindy, most witnesses claimed the packed atmosphere and strobe lights made it impossible to identify the gunman's face or clothing. Most witnesses were too scared to testify. The wall of silence at the Palladium led to stricter laws and better funding for witness protection in Canada, as authorities realized they could no longer rely on public cooperation in gangland hits. In the end, Bindy Johal was killed by the culture he helped create. After his death, the elite crew had fully collapsed. The associates who survived longer than Bindy did not fare well. The internal betrayal that allegedly led to the Palladium shooting eventually consumed the rest of the crew. The fragmentation that followed the 1998 shooting at the Palladium paved the way for some of the most notorious gangs in modern BC history. Bindy's chaotic life tragically ended on a nightclub dance floor, but the violence it sparked was only beginning. The wall of silence that protected his killer became the new standard. In the years that followed, the streets of Surrey, Richmond, and Vancouver would see hundreds more shots fired. But the players were different. They were younger, they were more fragmented, and they were even more desperate for the fame Bindy had achieved. The inability to solve Bindy Johal's murder, combined with the Gillian Guest scandal, forced a total overhaul of how BC handles organized crime. Years later, in another shocking underworld twist, Bal Buttar himself was the man who later claimed to have ordered the hit on Bindy. Following the murder, he was targeted in 2001. He survived a shooting in a Richmond hair salon, but was left a blind quadriplegic. He spent his final years in a long-term care facility, providing the confessions that would later form the basis of the most detailed accounts of the era. In a 2004 interview series conducted by Kim Bolan of the Vancouver Sun with Bal Buttar, he exposed some of the inner workings of the Indo-Canadian underworld. The most explosive revelation in the interview is Buttar's admission that he was the architect of Bindy Johal's 1998 murder. By that time, the man once known as Bindy's most ruthless enforcer was a shadow of his former self. From his hospital bed, Bal Buttar dropped a bombshell that recontextualized the entire gang war. He admitted to being the one who signed Bindy Johal's death warrant. To Buttar, it wasn't a betrayal, it was a preemptive strike. He painted a picture of a leader lost to paranoia, a man who had begun purging his own inner circle. In Buttar's own words, the choice was binary. He was quoted saying, "If I hadn't killed him, he would have got me." He cited Johal's deteriorating mental state and his habit of executing loyal associates as the primary catalysts for the hit. According to Buttar, the hierarchy of the Indo-Canadian underworld had started to become a death trap. He believed Bindy was actively plotting his murder, leaving him with only one card to play. At the time of the interview, Buttar was 28 years old. He was now blind and a quadriplegic following the 2001 shooting at a hair salon. He claimed to have found God and wanted to warn youth away from the attention, money, and power that lured him into the gang life. The Buttar confessions provided the missing piece to one of Vancouver's most famous cold cases. To this day, the murder of Bindy Johal remains officially unsolved. Bindy Johal remains one of the most documented, debated, and divisive figures in Canadian crime history, not because he was the most successful, but because he was the loudest. And in the underworld, the loudest voice is usually the first one silenced. You've been watching His Influence is Still Around, the life of BC's celebrity gangster Bindy Johal, part of an ongoing investigative series from Sad Girl Productions. This documentary is based entirely on publicly available information, including archived news reports, court documents, and community sources. While every effort has been made to present this story accurately and respectfully, all events, statements, and accounts discussed in this video remain alleged unless otherwise verified through official records. The purpose of this series is to document, educate, and analyze criminal history, not to glorify, promote, or condemn any individuals or groups involved. Viewers are reminded that many of the details shared in this episode stem from a combination of media coverage which have not all been independently confirmed. Sad Girl Productions makes no claim of factual certainty regarding any individual's actions or involvement. All subjects discussed are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Thank you for watching.